Righto, welcome everyone to what promises to be a fantastic practical education session for every athlete who probably struggles with their gut. And Alan's going to delve into, as the title says, gut training, what, why, and how. So without further ado, Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome everyone. I think this is an important topic because a lot of people obviously face gut issues of various different types during their training or racing, probably more so in racing, but sometimes for people it's in training as well. And so it's one of those issues that can be very significant for some people to the point where it's the difference between finishing a race or not. And so we're going to have a look at that. I guess I'd say from the outset that gut issues during exercise are not simple. There are multiple different causes, and you'll see that in a minute. And because of that, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution as well. I think in the past, people have sort of said, blame the gels or the drink, and if I just find this other brand, then all my problems will be solved. And not surprisingly, it doesn't usually work that way, and people get very frustrated with it. So I'll spend a little bit of time at the start just talking briefly about what actually causes gut issues during exercise, because as I said, it is complicated. I'm not going to go through it in detail because we could do another two-part Q&A on that alone. So we're not going to do that, but I'll touch briefly on the three kind of main mechanisms and some of the risk factors. And then we'll get into gut training, which is an important strategy, I think, for everyone, regardless of whether you get gut issues or not. I think it's still worth doing gut training, particularly so if you do get gut issues during exercise. But I guess, again, as I said, there are multiple different causes for gut issues during exercise. So gut training is not going to be a universal solution for everyone's gut issues during exercise as well. So I want to make that clear from the outset that we're not saying this is the one solution for everyone's gut problems. It won't be, but I think it's still important to do regardless of whether you have gut issues or not. This can be a really useful tool for other reasons that I'll get into as we go through. All right, so we're going to have a look at why gut issues occur. Obviously, what can we do about them? Also, I'll talk a little bit about when to address them, I guess, in your race preparation. Is this something you do in the week before the race, a month before the race, a year before the race? And I guess what that looks like from a gut training point of view, because there's kind of no clear consensus on that, but there are three kind of strategies that you can put into place at the moment that we know of. So I'm sure everyone knows who we are. Obviously, you've got Scott on the call. I didn't see Elizabeth here today, Scott. No.
I think Elizabeth is joining. I think she's just held up with with an athlete at this point in time.
Yeah, no drama. All right.
I'm here.
Ah, there you go. Excellent. All right. So as you can see, it's complicated. Why do I get gut issues during exercise? So this is a very stylized diagram that I did. The official ones that you see published in academic journals are far more complicated than this and very technical. So I sort of put this together for the podcast I co-host to try and simplify things a bit, although this is not simple by any means. But I guess if we look at the three sort of main mechanisms that underlie why people get gut issues during exercise, they're not the only things, but they're the three main things that are going on biologically. I've kind of put them into three buckets here, which are the sort of the white boxes with the headings at the top. So firstly, during exercise, there's a lack of blood flow to the gut. And so that can be worse in some situations than others. And you can see some risk factors at the top there, particularly in hot weather. That's more so the case because you get more of your blood flow going to the skin rather than to the gut. In high intensity exercise, because you get more blood flowing to the muscles rather than the gut. If you have a lack of nutrients, so you don't consume anything other than water during training or race, also that doesn't stimulate some of that blood flow to return to the gut. Whereas having some nutrition in your gut will actually stimulate some of that blood flow there. And I guess the issues with a lack of blood flow to the gut are a few different things that can go wrong. One is the actual cells that line your gut start to get damaged, and that causes a whole bunch of different problems. I won't go into detail here. Those are actually relatively uncommon. We tend to see them more in sort of ultra marathon type stuff in very hot environments, but it has happened in Ironman before. For those of you who recall, there was a famous Gatorade ad back in probably the late 90s or early 2000s. Was it Chris Lee? I can't remember now. Who, the big story of he collapsed and couldn't finish his race, and then he took Gatorade and miraculously he was finishing races and winning them again, but actually had a part of his bowel removed, I think, surgically, because it was so badly damaged. And so this is probably the mechanism that was happening in his case. There are other famous examples of this. One of the race walkers at the Rio Olympics, I think, where he was actually had blood coming out his backside halfway through the race, collapsed several times. He was winning the race by a mile. He was the world champion, and ended up, I think he actually managed to will himself across the line, but ended up 8th or 9th or something by the end of it. So there's pretty severe issues that can happen there. One of the things that's speculated about is an increased risk of chronic gut issues over the long term if that happens frequently. But we do know that for most people, this happens to some degree, but it's usually not too severe, and the gut's very good at repairing itself quickly, and it's not a long-term health issue, I guess you could say that. So the one in the middle is actually probably the most common issue here, and that's what I've called the stress response to exercise. So basically, exercise is technically a form of stress, whether we think about it like that or not. And that can have a couple of different components to it. It can be the physical stress of exercise. So that can be things like the intensity of exercise. So higher intensity tends to increase the stress response. Higher body temperature tends to increase the stress response. Dehydration tends to increase the stress response as well. There's been some cool research. One of my colleagues, Steph, at the uni I work at, did some nice work showing that the stress response at nighttime is worse than daytime. So obviously not for triathlon, but for ultra marathons and stuff, that's obviously relevant where they're going overnight as well. Another area that hasn't been explored a lot yet, but is starting to, is psychological stress as well. And so the impact of things like anxiety and race day nerves and that sort of thing on that stress response to exercise. And basically what happens is the typical kind of fight or flight response that you get is an increase in one of the parts of your nervous system that you don't consciously control. And basically it slows down the function of the gut. So the stomach's slows down the emptying rate, or some cases, if it's extreme, stops altogether. The intestines stop moving things through, and the system basically just kind of shuts down. And so, you get a lot of that kind of reflux, nausea, vomiting, cramping and pain in some cases, or you get the nutrients are just not being digested and absorbed properly, and it passes through eventually into the large intestine, which comes onto the final bucket there, which is, I've written it there in very technical terms, presence of fermentable stuff from food in the gut. And that can be fiber. It can be what we call FODMAPs, which is a bunch of different starches and sugars that humans generally don't digest and absorb very well, or at all in some cases. But it can also be normal carbs that you should be able to digest and absorb easily, but because of those first two issues are not being digested and absorbed easily in this particular person. You can also see this sometimes in people that have been following a very low carbohydrate diet for a long time and then decide to have 90 grams an hour of carbs in their race, is that their body just doesn't have the mechanisms in the gut wall to digest and absorb that amount of carbs because it's been adapted to a low carb diet. And so in that situation, the same thing can happen. So basically in this situation, you get all of this fermentable stuff, fiber, FODMAPs, other types of carbohydrates, usually entering the large intestine. And that does a couple of things. One, it sends feedback back to the stomach and says, well, hang on, stuff's getting to the end unabsorbed, slow down. Obviously things are going through too quickly. And so that slows down all the movement of everything through your gut, which is obviously going to cause gut issues when you're exercising. And the second thing that happens is the bacteria in your large intestine chew up all that fermentable stuff. That's the fermentation part of it. And they produce gas as a side effect of that. That draws water into the gut and gives you a lot of more the lower gastrointestinal issues, the flatulence, the diarrhea, those sorts of things as well, bloating, wind, cramping, etc. Now, I got a couple of things down the bottom there as well. And as I said before, with the low carb diet example, you can just have generally poor digestion and absorption of carbs. You can have just generally poor tolerance of food and fluids. So that could be, for example, that your stomach is not very good at stretching to accommodate the volume of food and fluids that you're consuming. And the extreme example of this, that someone who's very well adapted, would be those people who do major league eating that can eat 70 hot dogs in 10 minutes or whatever it is. They have a stomach that's very adapted to be able to stretch and accommodate that amount of food without it coming back up again. And it is trainable. You can train your stomach to stretch, and we'll talk about that. That's a big part of gut training. And the final part in the bottom left there is the mechanical side of things. And this is still a little bit controversial. A lot of people report that, gut issues are worse in running compared to cycling, for example. And it's still a bit of a chicken and egg question whether the act of running, the mechanics of going up and down actually make things worse, or whether it's simply that when people are running, or pure runners are probably less gut trained because they tend to be taking less carbs and fluid with them when they run. And the same may be true certainly for triathletes doing their run sessions as opposed to their bike sessions. So there is a thought there that, whether it's the mechanical issue or whether it's just less gut training specific to running, whichever one causes it, we don't know. Okay, so the question is, obviously, what do we do about all these sort of gut issues that can occur? The other thing I'll sort of add, sorry, just going back a sec, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So this is like your ibuprofens. In Australia, it's sold as Nurofen, but I'm sure it's different brand names in different countries. Those non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are really good at damaging the lining of your gut as well. And so a lot of athletes use these to manage, things like joint pain and those kind of things, but they can really wreak havoc on the gut. It's why they're recommended to be taken with food, but they certainly increase the risk of things going wrong gut-wise on race day as well. So they're certainly not recommended around that time if you can avoid it. So what do you do about all this stuff? Well, here's a bunch of what I'd call the modifiable factors on the left there. So these are the things that you can actually do something about. You can't change your genetics, obviously. You can't change being female. You can't change the length of a race. Or, you could choose to do shorter events, I suppose. But these are the things, as a general rule, you can actually take action on. So the first one is lack of nutrients in the gut. So often you see people that say, well, I'm carb loaded at the start of my event, and particularly in triathlon, when you've got the swim at the start as well, they'll go, well, I don't need to consume anything for the first 2 hours in exercise, and then I'm going to start having my carbs. The problem with that approach is that you've then created an environment in your gut where you've not stimulated the gut to have to do any digestion or absorption. So the blood's gone and flown off elsewhere. And by the time you stimulate that with having some carbs later on in your event, often the damage has already been done. So that can be potentially an issue. So certainly small, frequent amounts of carbohydrate starting right from the start of exercise. Obviously, when you're in the water, that's not possible, but in other training sessions and certainly early on the bike, you can do that. The presence of fiber or FODMAPs in the gut. So that's that kind of fermentable stuff. Some of that will actually come from what you've eaten the day before. So this particularly comes back to the carb loading, and we've talked about this before, that you're having low FODMAP, low fiber in that sort of day or two before a race can be really helpful from that perspective. For some people, but not everyone, fructose, which is one type of FODMAP, is a sugar that's not well absorbed in a lot of people, and so actually going fructose free can be helpful, but it also does limit your carb intake to about 60 grams an hour when you do that. So I usually see that as a last resort option, not the first thing I would look at. Poor tolerance of food and fluids. And so this is where your gut training comes in. I won't talk about this now because we're going to go into specifics about this shortly. The same with the poor carb digestion and absorption. So it may not be the volume or the amount of food that's going into the system, but simply the grams per hour of carbohydrate is overwhelming the gut's capacity to digest and absorb that. It can be both dehydration and overhydration can both be issues that increase the risk of gut problems during exercise. So that's where, doing your sweat testing with your Fuelin app and getting a sense of what that sweat rate is. Obviously, we've talked about that in a previous Q&A a month or so ago. So you can go back and have a look at that for more details about that. Elevated body temperature is certainly one of the biggest risk factors, and gut issues are much more prevalent when it's hot compared to cooler environments. The number one thing here is actually got nothing to do with nutrition, and that's heat acclimation or acclimatization. So being used to the body temperature going high will certainly bring about adaptations. Just like our muscles adapt to training, our body will adapt to heat as well. And so that's a really important step that makes a big difference in terms of keeping our body temperature a bit lower during exercise. For some events, pre-cooling may be relevant. I'd probably argue for triathlon less so, apart from maybe sprint distance, because you're going to get some cooling effect of the water in the swim anyway. And the event is so long that cooling effect will kind of wear off, and the intensity in Ironman is not going to be high enough that pre-cooling is going to make a massive difference anyway. So I'd say maybe for sprint distance, but also if you're doing half marathons and things, that's probably where pre-cooling is more relevant, or cycling criteriums and things like that.
Alan, would the pre-cooling therefore be more like for the running and cycling events? So are you saying something like an ice vest, knowing that temperatures are going to get high? I mean, how long does that last for, those pre-cooling sort of vests? I mean, my understanding is that cooling effect's not going to be for a significant duration. I see it in, you see it in team sports at halftime and things like that, in the rugby and the football. But would it be effective pre-marathon or something like that? If
well, it certainly has been used a lot pre-marathon. I think maybe the jury's still out a little bit in terms of the effectiveness over that period of time. I think definitely for half marathon. One, because it's shorter, but also the exercise intensity is higher. So the amount of body heat that you generate is greater per minute or per hour of exercise. But certainly it's been done a lot for like the marathon guys at Tokyo did a lot of pre-cooling, for example. It was done when the World Championships were in Qatar a few years ago as well.
And that's with the ice vests?
It can be ice vests, it can be ice slushies, it can be dipping towels in like buckets of ice water and then putting them over your legs as well. So there's a few different strategies that have been used over the years, and a lot of it has come down to the practicalities of the scenario. So in some situations, ice vests are easy to use. In some situations, they're just not practical. And so then they might go towards something like the slushies or the ice towels, or some combination of that, where you can keep it in an esky or something.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Certainly in dry heat, the number one thing you can do is try to keep the skin wet, in terms of water applied to the skin surface, because that'll evaporate off and cool you down just like sweat does, and that will actually reduce your sweat rate and help from a hydration point of view a little bit as well. Not so relevant to humid conditions. It doesn't work very well in that scenario. The anxiety side of things, as I said, is an area that's been less researched, but is starting to be researched now. So it's an interesting area that I think deserves more attention. And I think it's possibly one of the issues, we talked about this, I think, in the past with cramping, but I think the same is true here, that a lot of people say, no matter what I do, no matter how hard I work in training, I cannot replicate the issue. But as soon as I get to a race, it comes up every single time. And so then the questions are, well, what is fundamentally different on race day compared to training? If you can genuinely, work as hard and as long in training and still not get the issue, then this may be one of the factors that is different between training and race day, is the psychological side of things there. So obviously it's not in the nutrition realm, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning and considering here. And as I said before, the use of NSAIDs, trying to reduce or eliminate those around race time is going to be a really important one for a lot of people. And for some people, stimulants, things like caffeine, for example, can be a bit of an issue as well. So maybe consider that. And there's obviously going to be pros and cons to things like caffeine. There are pros, but there's potentially cons as well. So again, you need to have a think about that and have a play around with that and see what works for you. Now, I guess the key thing here with this information, and also what I showed on the previous one here, is that there's obviously lots of different reasons that can cause your gut issues, but you don't want to get into the mentality of saying, what is my reason, as if it's just one thing, because you could have 5 of these things going on at the same time. So even if this is sort of presented like, well, if it's this issue, do this, if it's this issue, do that, the reality is for most people, it's probably more than one of these things going on at the same time. And as far as I'm aware at the moment, there's only one lab in the entire world that can actually do a comprehensive test to identify your specific issues. So you kind of have to assume that it's everything and try and control as many of the controllables as you possibly can. And then over time, maybe you can figure out, this one's not so relevant to me, or it's a cold weather race, so I don't need to worry about the heat stuff and things like that, and start to eliminate things. But I think in the beginning, when you've got gut issues, you kind of have to try and control as many of these things at the same time as you can, which is
Alan,
a lot of
where is that
organization
lab?
and a lot of work. Sorry?
Where's that lab?
Oh, it's where I work at Monash in Melbourne. So I'm personally, that's not my area of research, but it's the same lab that I work in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's good for athletes to know that, if they do, they're either, struggling with things and, or very high performing and want to get it under control or get a better insight, then there is that option of a nice little holiday to Melbourne in Australia and, booking. It is, what is it? It's like a 3 or a 5 hour session, isn't it? With Ricardo and whatnot. And I think it is something that is, I think worth mentioning, because for some athletes that might be the last resort.
Yeah. Yep. And I'll show you an example later on of an athlete who did exactly that, a pro athlete.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so that gets us on to gut training. And as I said before, this is not clearly the only strategy. You still need to look at the temperature and the hydration and the psychology and all those sort of things and what you're doing the day before with your carb loading. But gut training is still, as I said before, an important strategy. And I think one that benefits everyone, regardless of whether you have massive gut issues that are causing you to DNF a race or not. I think it's still a good idea to do in the lead up to your races, regardless. So I guess there's 2 parts to this when we think about gut training. One is increasing the gut's tolerance to the amount and types of food and fluids. And they're 2 separate types of gut training, the food and fluid training. I'll talk about those shortly. And the other one is increasing the body's ability to actually digest and absorb carbohydrate from that food and fluids during exercise. So 2 different sort of biological things that we're trying to train the gut to do. So how do we do this? Well, there's a few things that we need to consider here. There's 3 basic types of gut training at this stage that we have described. The one thing I would say is that there is currently no consensus on this is the best way to gut train. At the moment, there's probably only 2, maybe 3 research papers in the world that have ever looked at gut training. And so it's not like we've done 20 different studies and then worked out what the best strategy is. There is a student at Monash at the moment doing her PhD, trying to, I guess, add to this and come up with some better guidelines. So at this stage, I guess where we're at is a combination of the studies that have been done, what they did, and sort of anecdotal feedback and experience from athletes and practitioners and coaches, really. So I guess the first thing is, well, what type of training sessions would you dedicate to doing gut training? And I would generally say this is not something just to do on your easy recovery sessions. Like if you're doing a 1 hour zone 1 workout or something like that, you're not really going to push the limits of gut tolerance in that kind of a session anyway. So I guess the way I think about it is, just like we train our muscles by doing training sessions that are hard, and that brings about some form of adaptation. We have to stress the system in some way to get an adaptation. And it's the same with gut training. Unless we're actually making the gut work hard for it, whatever outcome, it's not going to adapt, and there's no need for it to adapt. So I guess the analogy I like to use is there's no point, like if you went out and did a zone 3 or 4 session and you said, oh, that was really hard, so from now on I'm only going to do zone 1 sessions because I don't like feeling uncomfortable. That's, you probably never improve, at least at that top end stuff. And it's the same here with gut training. If you go, oh, I never want to feel any form of discomfort in my gut ever in training, and so therefore I'm going to avoid fiber, I'm going to avoid fluids, I'm going to avoid, much carbohydrate. Well, your gut tolerance is never going to improve. You're going to have to get to some level of discomfort if you want it to adapt. Now, obviously, we're not talking about people eating till they vomit or anything like that. It doesn't have to be that extreme, but you are going to expect some level of discomfort in this. So longer sessions are really good for this because, again, you're testing that tolerance over a longer period of time. Some of the higher intensity sessions are useful for this as well. But again, you're kind of pushing that limit. But, you're not going to do this in, max effort, sprint intervals or anything like that. That's probably going to be a recipe for disaster. In terms of how frequently to do it, again, this is one of the areas that we don't have a lot of information yet. the information that we do have suggests that gut training, well, the original studies was like 5 days a week for 2 weeks. So 10 sessions over 2 weeks, and you got an improvement within just 10 sessions. Now, you probably don't have to, and certainly anecdotally, I'd say you don't have to do every single session is a gut training session. It can be maybe 2 or 3 sessions a week. So maybe one of your long sessions on the weekend, and then maybe 1 or 2 of the sessions where you're pushing the pace a little bit during the week. And usually most people will say after about 3 to 4 weeks of that, they can already start to notice a pretty substantial difference in terms of tolerance. Now, there's 3 different types of tolerance training that you can do. The type that you choose will partly depend on what sort of tolerance issues you feel that you have. So the first one is improving gastric tolerance. So this comes back to what I was talking about before about the competitive eaters and the ability to have the stomach expand and accommodate a certain volume of food and fluids. Now, one of the easiest and best ways to do this is actually to go out and train on a full stomach. So eat a main meal shortly before training. Now, if you find it really challenging, or you're someone that never eats before training, you might start off small with a snack of some sort. And then even if that's just, causing some discomfort, and then you might, as time goes on, build that up until you can get to a main meal. For other people, they might go, let's just start off with the main meal. And this is another area of gut training that we still don't have good answers for. Is it better just to go to the end goal and put up with a lot of discomfort at the start and then basically force the adaptation? Or is it better to sort of increase things in a graded approach? Again, we just don't know. Those studies have not been done yet. So using more sort of solid type foods during training is another approach. So rather than using drinks and gels, using things like bananas and rice cakes and those kind of things, again, just to increase the volume of stuff that's going into your stomach during training. So you can do one or the other, or a combination of both can be useful. The second one is improving fluid tolerance. So this is specifically around your stomach being able to hold a certain volume of fluid in there. The stomach empties at a very specific rate. As far as we're aware so far, gut training doesn't make a massive difference on increasing that. I guess you think about it like a funnel. So what you're increasing is the big part at the top of the funnel, so you can hold more in there, but it's not necessarily emptying out any faster. So I guess what we're aiming to do from a fluid tolerance point of view, and what the research has done so far, is to drink enough fluid to basically cover 100% of your sweat losses. Now, normally we wouldn't advise to do that in a race setting, but this is specifically for gut training. So you're basically replacing every drop of fluid that you lose because you're trying to push that limit of what the body's capable of doing. And then you might eventually aim to get up to 120% of your expected sweat rate on race day. So we've talked about this with hydration testing before, that you're going to have a range that you sit in. So this might be going to 120% of the top of that range. Now, the only caution I would say here is I would probably do this in sessions of less than 3 hours, because if you're starting to overhydrate for longer than that, I guess there is that risk of hyponatremia or just having to pee an awful lot. So obviously you don't want to be in that situation where you're causing yourself ill health to try and get the gut training. But generally anything under 3 hours, you're not going to be able to, unless you're drinking, 400% of your fluid losses or something like that, you're not going to push yourself into that point of hyponatremia. Now, the final type of gut training is more around that digestion and absorption of carbs. So that's increasing the grams per hour of carbs that you're having during exercise. As I said before, you can do this in one of 2 ways. You can start at the amount that you want to get to for race day and just basically take the sledgehammer approach. It might be very uncomfortable to begin with, but you'll adapt. The other process, which may be better if you don't have much carbs during training at the moment, you're sort of down below maybe 40 grams an hour, is to increase it in steps. So you might go from, say you're at 30 at the moment grams an hour, you might go up to 60 for a while. And if that gets comfortable, then go up to 80 for a bit. And if that gets comfortable, maybe push it a bit higher if you want to do that for race day. And again, what we're probably aiming for here is to get up to 120% of what you plan to have on race day. So the idea behind that is that if your body can tolerate 100 grams an hour, then you get to race day and only have 80 grams an hour, it should be super easy and you have no problem with it at all. Now, this is where you can use the Fuelin carb tolerance test. to actually log these during training, so you can keep track of what you're doing and how you're going with it, and you can go back and look at your data and see the progress over time. So that's a good way to capture that data, particularly in relation to the actual training sessions themselves.
Alan, can I just add a couple of things to that? I think this is really fantastic slide, actually, just to really highlight how an athlete can do this, and just relating it back to the Fuelin program and the app, so the athletes know how we're addressing this. In terms of the gastric tolerance, the bit up the top, when you are told, or when it says eat a red snack or a yellow snack before the session, you will see the timing there as well. We will recommend sort of 60, 90 minutes before, but there's also that sentence there that if you're practicing gut training, there is a reduced period before going out and doing that. And, to Alan's point, if you're one of those athletes that does struggle with this, read what the recommendations are there and go, you know what, I'm going to try that gut training in this instance. The message is there, and it's very clear in the app to help you, and that's why it's there. In terms of improving fluid tolerance, again, as Alan said, like, this is where you're using that sweat rate feature in the app to work out what your sweat loss is at a given intensity for the chosen discipline, whether it be the bike or the run. Working out, okay, I lose that much as an average. If you're a person who struggles with fluid tolerance, then yes, we provide you with a recommendation of around 60, 70% of that intake, but look at what your average fluid loss is and actually try and hit that, to Alan's point. So you're hitting 100% of that average amount that you're losing. And then to the last part, improving carbohydrate digestion, so the recommendations for intake of carbohydrates is specific to the amount you're logging in the carb capacity tests. So to Alan's point, if you're only logging 40 grams an hour as an average, you will be put in a bucket of, say, 40 to 50 grams an hour as a recommendation. Now, once you get to that 50 grams an hour, the upper level or the upper amount of what's being recommended, you'll be pushed into the bucket above. So then the recommendation will go from 40 to 50 grams an hour to 50 to 70 grams an hour. And again, like, start to aim towards that upper number there. So once you hit the 70 grams an hour, you'll be then pushed into the bucket above that, which will then be, 70 to the 120 grams an hour. And then you can start. So you see, we're actually pushing you based on the data that you're putting into the app. So this is another form of how the app is directing you to improve the digestion, the absorption, and improve your tolerance to carbohydrates if that is something that you're struggling with. So the more information, and the app will direct you as you go, but just know that the more information you put into the app, the smarter and the better the recommendations will be for you.
And I think one of the important points with gut training too is that there's lots of different ways to get, say, 40 grams of carbs. You can get that purely from liquids, which is in most cases not really going to push you from a tolerance point of view, or you can get that from something quite substantial. And so from a gut training point of view, it's not just about the grams of carbs, it's about the volume of food involved. I was just reading this morning, actually, some reflections on the Tour de France this year, and those guys, a few teams had been sort of pushing 80, 90 grams an hour of carbs in races like the Tour for a few years now. This year, one of the teams actually hit, a lot of their riders were hitting 130 grams an hour of carbs for the first time. But as they pointed out, they weren't getting any of that. 10 years ago, they were getting a lot of that from foods, rice cakes and bananas and those kind of things. They're not doing any of that now, because to get right up to that volume in a race situation, they just can't tolerate it. But they will use that in training. And that's an important point here too, I think, is that, gut training, often you can use some of these solid foods in training, but then revert to more gels and drinks and things on race day, because again, that's going to make race day easier. If you can tolerate that volume in training, and then you go to a less bigger volume on race day, that'll make it even easier.
Get comfortable being uncomfortable, everyone.
Yeah.
It's probably an important quote to remember.
Yes. So this is the example I was talking about before. So this is, I think he's actually just recently retired, actually, Eneko Llanos. He's a Spanish, or was a pro triathlete. As I said, he's no longer a pro. But he actually flew out He, for those of you who don't know Eneko, he represented Spain at the 2000 and 2004 Olympics and then switched to long course. I think he was second at Kona in 2007 or 2008, I think, behind Chris McCormack, I think, from memory. But he hit a rut in sort of the mid 2010s where he was getting these major gut issues to the point where he was regularly DNFing races. And as a pro, obviously that's your career. That's a big problem. So he actually did fly all the way out to Melbourne and come to the lab at Monash and do the gut assessment. So Steph and I actually interviewed him on the podcast, and this is a quote from that podcast. And yeah, he was someone who we looked at all of these different factors. Was it body temperature? Was it hydration? Was it a functional gut issue? You know, all these different stuff that we do in that test. And the result was it didn't seem to be any of those things in particular. It was really just simply a gut training issue. So, yeah, he was sort of in a bit of disbelief when Ricardo turned around to him and just said, well, you just need to train your gut. You just need to go out and eat, hot dogs before you train and things. And Eneko said, well, I'm vegetarian. I'm not going to do that. But he did find something else he could do instead. So this was kind of his reflections on that period of gut training. And this, I think, was in 2018. And he said, at first I'd do my runs with a lot of discomfort and stitches and everything, but I kept doing this in my longer workouts, especially the longer runs and the brick sessions. In the bricks, he would often finish a ride, then eat a meal or a snack, and then go out and do the run. Again, to try and get some of that sort of gut training, that gut tolerance in. And for him, that was the big thing, probably more than the hydration. It was that gut tolerance of food and fluids. And he would do that in 1 or 2 run sessions a week to deliberately have that pressure in his stomach to make it adapt. And then he had about 3 or 4 months from when he left the lab at Monash before he did Ironman Arizona later that year. And he described this. He actually got really emotional on the podcast when he was talking about this. He said, I started running, my stomach and gut worked perfectly, had no issues, felt very strong, energy levels were high. And constant during the race. And he actually got to 10 to 15 Ks into the run and actually started breaking down in tears on the run. It was the first time he'd actually been able to finish a run at his kind of race pace for quite a long period of time. And he actually, as I said, broke down in tears on the podcast talking about this and said he, still cries remembering that moment because it was so significant for him. It took him so long to realize what was going on with his gut and to find a solution. He tried keto, he'd tried vegan, he'd consulted about 5 different practitioners, and he just couldn't find any solution to his problem. And in the end, as he said, it was almost so simple, was just, training his gut. Now, as I said before, that is not going to be the cause of or the solution for everyone, but it is a significant help to a lot of people. And even if you don't have those sort of major gut issues that are causing you to DNF, it can still be something that improves your ability. Maybe you're currently getting in 70 grams an hour in a race. Maybe you could get 90, but you probably need to train up to that. Okay. So just to summarize all of that, I guess, firstly, gut issues are very complicated. There are many different causes, and there can be multiple causes going on at the same time. So, just changing one thing at a time to try and figure out the cause actually doesn't work with gut issues because, you might take one factor out and there's still another 4 in there. And so you think, oh, well, that wasn't the problem. And you put it back in and then you take the next one out and you never find the issue. So you really have to look at what are all the things that you can control and try and control, at least in the beginning, as many of those as you possibly can. So it's not going to be an easy fix or an easy problem. And if what we talk about here doesn't help you, then that's probably where having some one-on-one support to try and help you work through that would be recommended. Gut training can be helpful. As I said before, I think regardless of whether you have major gut issues or not, I think it's still definitely helpful. And sometimes it can be also, not necessarily perceived gut issues, but you're just not able to get in the volume of fluid that you need to stay well hydrated as well. That's another common reason for gut training, is more it's a hydration issue than a gut issue. It takes time and effort to get the adaptations. You should expect some discomfort at the start. If you don't have discomfort, you're probably not pushing it enough that you're actually going to get those adaptations. But you don't need to push it to the point of severe discomfort or, bowel issues or vomiting or anything like that. Definitely not. It's just that sort of feeling of discomfort of being full and bloated. But be patient and certainly be organized is the other thing I'd say here. So when you start to push up the amount of fluid, the amount of carbs, the types of foods that you're having as well, particularly during training and particularly during run training. That does take a little bit more organization for a lot of people that are used to going out and running with just one little soft flask with not much fluid or nothing at all, that all of a sudden they're going to have to carry more fluid with them, or do a circuit past their house and have fluids there, or past wherever the training group starts from, and have stuff organized there to pick up along the way, rather than doing it out and back with no access to food and fluids along the way. So it does require a little bit more organization as well to make that happen. All right.
Thank you, Alan. That was excellent. You want to we'll close the presentation, stop the share, and we'll just open it up to the crew. I just want to say, like, I get inundated with questions about gut issues from athletes, and I hope what can be seen from this is it is complicated. It's not one reason, and actually don't try and figure it out yourself. Like, I can tell you now, those athletes, again, and I know it probably sounds like a broken record, but book a consultation and go through it systematically with Alan, Elizabeth, and myself, and it can save you so much time, because it will be directed and it will be purposeful, rather than you flapping in the wind and trying to work it out yourself. Like, we might be able to short circuit that. And I know there's probably athletes on this call who are like, oh God, he's speaking to me, but like, literally just do it and it will save you a lot of hassle. I think that I did want to ask a question, Alan, like, how influential do you think an athlete's history is to gut issues? Like, low carb diets for a long time, maybe low energy availability, poor in session or no in session fueling history, and maybe poor hydration. Like, if of all those things, is there one in particular that you think sort of would influence, say, gut issues more than the other? Or is it sort of like that, if you look at that recipe, it's that recipe for disaster that really pushes an athlete to say, okay, well, you're probably going to be predisposed to gut issues, and so you've got to unwind all that?
Yeah, like, I think you're right. I think it can be any or all of those things. But I think all of those ones that you just mentioned are modifiable. So, you follow a keto diet, even if you've done it for 10 years, if you start eating carbs again, your body's going to recognize that and start to produce more of the little transporters within your gut that absorb carbohydrate from the gut. The bits within your cells that turn carbohydrate into fuel are going to start to be produced again. So it's not like you do keto for too long and it's irreversible or anything like that. And so that would be the same for the dehydration, all those sorts of things. I guess the things that are not going to be modifiable might be any kind of genetic variation. Obviously we have people with lactose intolerance, for example, but there'll be other kind of functional gut type things going on in some people. Some people may just be more susceptible and more sensitive to the symptoms. And I guess one thing I forgot to mention was that there can still be clinical gastrointestinal issues that are underlying some of these issues as well. And I've had an example of that with a Fuelin athlete just over the last couple of months, actually, where we were noticing a pattern of gut issues, a pattern of what we thought was low energy availability and weight loss. And it actually turned out she had undiagnosed celiac disease, which has now been diagnosed. And so now she's starting a gluten-free diet. And what we're probably going to see is, well, firstly, her carbohydrate, she's getting a lot more bang for her buck for carbohydrate, because half of it wasn't even being absorbed before. So, if it is worth looking at the medical side of things as well, just to rule out any of those sort of clinical issues. And particularly if you're getting gut issues day to day outside of training, then that's probably a flag that there's a clinical gastrointestinal issue going on as well. And it can be more simple things. Well, I say simple things like irritable bowel syndrome, which is, I guess, not as medically complicated in a way that, say, celiac disease would be, but can affect people just as severely symptom-wise. And that can be a major issue. So people may be more sensitive to like that gas production in the large intestine, for example, and feel, more severe symptoms from the same process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And obviously what was really interesting then, you said, she's celiac, so she's obviously removed gluten, which is a key consideration for a celiac, but she's still eating carbohydrates.
Yeah.
and I guess like, because so often I hear this with athletes, oh, I'm going to cut out gluten, and then they remove all carbohydrates from their diet, and they wonder why they're still getting issues. It's like, and I guess that then relates to IBS with, say, FODMAPs. It might be a certain type of carbohydrate, and it may not be gluten. So you may not be celiac. Like, make sure the diagnosis is correct, I guess, is what you're saying. Is
absolutely.
You know, if you suspect there is celiac, then the diagnosis is going to be, you know, you're going to have a scope, and they're probably going to visualize and actually look at it. Don't try and self-diagnose yourself with a gluten allergy or gluten intolerance. Like, be systematic about it and be, you know, scientific in your approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Because either you're going to half-heartedly do the gluten-free diet, it's not going to help if you do genuinely have celiac disease, or you're unnecessarily restricting food for the rest of your life that you didn't need to.
Correct. And we've seen that before, and we've talked about that. Like, you know, you get that inadvertent, you know, low energy availability because it was unconscious. You weren't consciously consuming the amount of food because you were removing a certain macronutrient, i.e. carbohydrates, from the diet unnecessarily. And so, you know, again, I think it's just so important for athletes to, like, rely on people around you to help you. You don't have to try and figure it out yourself. And I think it's, you know, it's really good to highlight all these potential issues, as you say, like a gut issue. We hear gut training a lot, and we talk about gut training a lot because it often does help an athlete, doesn't it? Like, when they start doing it, they eat a meal before a session, they start in session fueling, it gets better and better. And, you know, for 80% of athletes, it probably helps. But there is going to be that 20% where all those other complications, like I think you highlighting medication, like, it's something that I don't always think about, but then you start talking to them and they're like, oh yeah, I take naproxen. I've been taking naproxen for years, or ibuprofen or whatever. And and then it's like, oh, well, that's going to damage your gut. Okay, let's think about that. So is there anything athletes can do in terms of, if there is that damage to the gut lining, what would you recommend? Is there any particular nutrients or food types that they should be taking, or any supplements that maybe could help reverse that damage?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably two parts to this. I guess firstly, prevention is much better than cure. And so prevention would be to have, you know, be well hydrated, try not to let your body temperature get too high in those hot environments as much as you can. Obviously, sometimes it's unavoidable. And having regular, even if it's small amounts, but regular amounts of carbohydrate going into the gut, because that tends to keep some of that blood flow there. Once that damage occurs, it's occurred, it's going to heal. The cells that line our gut are probably the fastest turning over cells within the entire body, because they're exposed to so much stuff. And so usually what you see is that those cells will turn over and repair themselves within about 24 to 36 hours anyway. So it's not like you then have to go on some big long recovery process or anything like that. It's usually, well, it's happened now. You stop your exercise, and by the time you train a day or two later, you're okay, kind of thing. In terms of supplements, there's been a lot talked about things like glutamine, for example. The research really doesn't suggest that it's that helpful, maybe in some of the clinical ones, but not in exercise related sort of gut issues. And I guess a lot of those supplements it's kind of what we would call like secondary prevention. It's sort of saying, well, okay, well, I've damaged myself. Now what do I do? As opposed to, well, let's stop the damage in the first place. And so it's generally, maybe there's small effects there, but they're going to be much smaller than the things that you can do to stop it from happening in the first place.
In terms of, you mentioned glutamine, it is something I've used anecdotally with athletes. And when I've looked at the studies, a lot of the dosages have been very low, say 5 grams or so. And they're given it, and anecdotally, when tend to get athletes taking sort of 20 grams and thinking about that, they tend to report improved outcomes in terms of reduced gastric sort of distress. Have you had any similar experiences with that, with higher doses of glutamine?
Not specifically. as I said, I mean, in the research that we've done at Monash, most of it has been around like giving carbohydrate or protein during exercise.
Yep.
Both seem to be equally effective, just having something in the gut. Ironically, having FODMAPs in the gut is actually protective because, again, it's giving the gut something to do, but it then causes other issues. Whereas having just normal carbohydrate in there gives the gut something to do without those issues. So that's not so much a problem. I don't think I've seen any evidence yet to suggest that the glutamine would be helpful. Like, it's helpful probably if you consume no carbohydrate, but just consume the carbohydrate is going to help you from a fueling point of view anyway, and it's going to be protective of your gut rather than having to worry about glutamine. I mean, that said, I mean, glutamine's not terribly expensive. It's not harmful or anything like that. There's no side effects. So yeah, if you want to use it, but just don't expect that it's going to be the magic bullet, I guess, that a lot of people have kind of marketed or made it out to be.
Yeah, I certainly don't recommend it as a part of the in-session fueling. I tend to get them taking fairly high doses out of that and generally including it in if they are taking a shake or something like that as recovery.
Yeah.
You mentioned there, and it was something actually professional athlete Kat Matthews asked, because we obviously made a post about carbohydrates and fiber being protective for the gut lining. Can you just talk about carbohydrates and fiber? And you mentioned FODMAPs there, and that will obviously include some fiber. Can we just mention what the research is there? Because Kat was actually quite skeptical of our claim that carbohydrates and fiber are actually protective for the gut lining. So if you could just outline that research.
Yeah. So there's a couple of parts to that. So one comes back to another student, Rhiannon Snipe, who did her PhD at Monash just around the time that I was doing mine. And she did a study where people, came into the lab, hot conditions, I think 35 degrees Celsius. So what's that, about 95 or something Fahrenheit off the top of my head, running for 2 hours in that weather, no carbohydrate, so just water, or water with carbohydrate, or water with protein. And then the amount of carbohydrate or protein wasn't massive. Where I think it was maybe 45 grams an hour, something like that. So not huge doses, but spread pretty evenly throughout the 2 hours. And then there's a marker that you can measure in the blood, which is a pretty good proxy for intestinal damage. And you could see that basically in the group that had just plain water, marker went up. So signs of intestinal damage, which you generally need at least 2 hours at that kind of 60% VO2 max type intensity to get there. But in the group that had the carbohydrate or the protein, it was literally a flat line. They just had nothing, no sign of damage whatsoever.
What's the marker?
And then intestinal fatty acid binding protein.
Okay.
It's a tricky one to interpret, because often you see small changes that don't actually mean anything in the real world, but people jump on and go, "Oh my God, there's a change." So you do have to be careful with how you interpret it.
But there was a very distinct level of that marker with water versus protein. And so,
exactly.
Although I guess you could say it's correlation, it's a fairly strong correlation between the ingestion of carbohydrates and protein.
It literally goes up into damaged territory without any nutrients, and it doesn't rise at all with the nutrients.
And was
the other evidence?
Sorry, Al, was the form of carbohydrate like a glucose or a maltodextrin or something like that? Was there any fiber included in that particular study? Okay.
No. And then the second bit of evidence is from Steph Gaskell, who I did my PhD with. So she did a 24-hour low versus high FODMAP diet the day before exercise, and again saw less intestinal damage actually on the high FODMAP diet, which is basically things that are going to get undigested and absorbed passing through into the large intestine. And so they're sitting there still in the gut when they did the exercise the next day. And so that again seems to be protective, because again it's stimulating blood flow. As far as we know, that's the best explanation to the gut, and therefore being protective. Fiber theoretically should do the same, but while it was protective, you got more gut symptoms because of the other issues that causes in terms of feeding back through the nervous system to slow down the stomach and the movement of things through the gut. So from that perspective, yes, you could go with some fiber or some FODMAPs, but you're going to sort of reduce one problem and cause another problem. Whereas just having carbohydrate while you're exercising solves one problem without causing the other problem. So certainly our recommendation would be to go the low fiber, low FODMAP the day before, but then just have some carbs during exercise, and that'll achieve the same thing essentially.
Yeah, I remember talking to Ricardo Costa about this as well, your colleague, because I think he was one of the authors on that paper with it. And his recommendation, and something that I've certainly included and it's helped athletes, is that low fiber in that 24 to 48 hours prior, but then on the morning of, actually having some carbohydrate and fiber containing meal, again, if it works for the athlete. And more often than not, it tends to actually help them feel very good on race day, even though they are taking in some fiber on the morning. And again, I guess if it's, somewhere between that FODMAP, the carbohydrates, the fiber, and, I guess the research is probably wanting. We probably need more research, but it's certainly, I think it's interesting that there is evidence that, again, carbohydrates and fiber can be heat protective, and it's probably, like most things in nutritional science, more research required.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one we haven't talked about at all is pre and probiotics. So we did some work around that. The evidence for probiotics actually for gut issues in athletes is actually pretty weak. Most of it suggests it actually does nothing, and there has been some suggestion that actually makes things worse. Particularly if you do get that gut damage and then you've got more bacteria down there, you've got more stuff to then get into your bloodstream and cause havoc. So at this stage, there's no specific recommendations around probiotics. There is one study from the UK that showed a benefit, but when you look at the detail of that study, it looks like in the placebo group, actually, they drank more water and had more gut discomfort at the end, probably because they drank more water, not because the probiotic actually did something. There is a little bit of evidence for prebiotics, but it's still far from conclusive.
And that's taking in, I think I know the studies you're referencing, it was taking in inulin, is that correct? Where they were using inulin
there's a few different types.
They were using FOS and GOS as the forms of prebiotic, and that was showing some improvements.
Yeah. The trouble there is that those are also the things that could cause some gut, because they're FODMAPs. They could then cause gut issues in training if you're doing it for 8 weeks before your race. So it becomes a trade-off between, do I put up with a bit of symptoms in training to be better on a race day or not? Yeah.
What is the core temperature that potentially can cause some of that, leaky, if you want to call it leaky gut, or the potential for proteins to get through those junctions?
Yeah, it seems to be above 39 Celsius for at least 2 hours or more. So if you're only dipping up that high, right at the end of your race, not going to be a problem. If you're doing shorter events, not going to be a problem. But for something like Ironman in hot weather, if you get up that high, sort of halfway through your bike and sit there for the rest of the day, that's where there's potential for concern. But as I said, that's when adding carbohydrate into the mix regularly kind of mitigates that risk as much as you can. And obviously anything else you can do from a cooling point of view, although that's obviously something like an Ironman that's fairly limited in terms of what you can access mid-race.
Yeah. No, all very interesting information. I think it just comes back to that the gut is a complicated system and it interacts, as you said, even with the brain. And, that it's, I think the anxiety part, I have listened to a few people talk about that, and, that race anxiety having a significant effect in restricting blood flow or increasing blood flow to the gut. And, again, I guess athletes will know if they get those pre-race jitters, and is that what sends them to the toilet, and maybe working on those aspects could have significant impact on sort of that race day as well. So I think it's a really, although not necessarily nutrition related, still it impacts nutrition. So I think it's a really good point to bring up.
Alan, I just want to quick ask, since we didn't touch on this, and I work with a lot of the perimenopausal and menopausal women, do we see any difference in the gut training in males versus females, in different ages, in both, in older women? Like, is there evidence for any of that?
In terms of gut issues, yes, there does seem to be more common in females. Now, whether that's sort of the interaction between hormones and the nervous system quite possibly. And certainly a lot of people anecdotally report that around menopause and sort of postmenopausal. I don't think there's any research specifically on that. Again, with age a little bit, I guess some of the tricky bits interpreting the age in some of that sort of observational research is that sometimes you can't tell whether it's an effect of age or effect of being in the sport for a long time. And how do you separate those two things? So it's not always obvious depending on how the research was captured. And sometimes you see the flip side to that is sort of like, well, in some studies, for example, in cramping, people that have been around the sport a long time seem to have less cramping. Well, is that because they're better conditioned, or is that because people who cramped a lot quit the sport and aren't any longer in it? You don't really know. So yeah, sometimes it's hard to pick apart the cause and effect in some of that stuff. But yeah, certainly anecdotally, females and as we get older, it is more common, and longer duration of events is more common as well.
So would we then want the women to do gut training longer, or like at least anticipate the need to do it longer if they experience more issues, because potentially it might be harder to work out?
Yeah, look, I don't think necessarily. I mean, we don't have any evidence, so it's hard to say. But I wouldn't necessarily think it would take longer to train the gut in that population. I guess what you might say is, okay, maybe we've got further to go. Maybe we're starting from a lower base, so therefore we need to leave it longer. And I think with any of these, I think one of the important things is like how far before your race do you start doing gut training? And I would say a minimum of 2 months. But the longer you've got, the better, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're sort of, 70% gut trained, but next week it's race week sort of thing. You want to get to 100%, and you don't know how long that's going to take. For some people, it might be as simple as 2 or 3 weeks. In other people, it may take 2 or 3 months. And so you want to leave yourself the time in case it does take longer than you expect, not knowing how long that might take.
Great, thank you.
Alan, last question, because I know everyone's going to jump off, but you mentioned like 2 to 3 times a week for, say, 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 weeks of gut training. Yeah, for some athletes, they don't have those sessions built into their week. And is it feasible then? Like, I know a lot of the studies were 10 consecutive days. If they can only do it once a week, would it theoretically, and this is something I usually talk about with athletes, is, it could take you 10 weeks, therefore, if you're only doing it once a week. Is that reasonable to expect, or are you saying it's better to do higher frequency over shorter periods of time if it's available?
We just don't know.
We just don't know. Yeah.
So Isabel, who's doing her PhD at the moment, I think is trying to start to look at some of these issues, but we don't know yet.
Yeah.
I guess the one thing I would say is if it's not that frequent but spread out over a long time, it's like any kind of adaptation. Like if you train once a week, you possibly start to lose some of that adaptation before you get the next hit. And so it may be the same with gut training. We don't know what that interval is yet. That, if it's more than, say, 7 or 8 or 9 days apart, are you starting to lose the effect from the first session before you get to the second one? So you actually don't improve, or you improve incredibly slowly. We don't know.
Yeah.
So, what we can say is probably about 10 sessions, but what's the longest amount of time you can stretch out those 10 sessions? Yeah, it's going to be a while, I think, before we can answer that with confidence.
I think your analogy, like we know with training, let's do squats. If you do squats once a week, it takes you're probably not going to get much of an adaptation, I guess. Do it twice a week, you're probably going to be better. 3 times a week, you'll probably see maximal gain. So I guess in that sense, like, I guess every athlete is bound to the practicalities. And if they only have 1 session, they can do it. Great. 2 sessions might be better. 3 sessions might be the ideal. And I guess that's, again, something to work through with your coach, with your, nutrition expert, is look at, can you increase that frequency potentially? Not just doing that gut training, but looking at how you're doing it and how often you're doing it. So just another consideration for everyone out there.
Yeah.
Look, Alan, fantastic. I hope everyone really enjoyed that. I didn't see any questions from athletes, and I know we've gone overboard, but please fill in the questionnaire at the end of the call. If you've got follow-up questions, certainly send them through. And as I said, if you are one of those athletes who does struggle with gut issues, then certainly look to, you can either do it directly through the Fuelin app or via the website, but certainly seek out the expertise of Alan and Elizabeth to get their assistance. But thank you, Alan. Really thought provoking. I'm sure a lot of athletes are now thinking about what's what they're doing and how they're approaching it if they do have gut issues. So yeah, really, really.
So
great.
I think Phil
Alan.
had a question.
I
Do you
think
have a
she
question,
said
Phil?
thank you. Oh, can you check my computer if you can hear me? No, we can't hear you, Phil.
You're muted at the moment.
Yeah. Guys, I've actually got to jump off because I've got a call I've got to attend. So Phil, maybe send it through in the app and we'll do our best to help you. But thank you, everyone.
Alan,
And
thanks,
we'll
guys.
see you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
See ya.
Thanks, Al. Bye.